Hello everyone, today we are going to discuss an important question. Is a low or high inflation rate an absolute indicator of an economy in a good or bad state? Explain. First, let's start by understanding what inflation is. Inflation is the increase in the price of goods and services over time. When inflation is high, price rise quickly. When inflation is low, price is rise slowly. Okay, for this question, a low or high inflation rate is not an absolute indicator of whether an economy is in a good or bad state, because the inflation rate must be analyzed with other factors such as economic growth, unemployment, wage trends, and so on. A low inflation rate can be sign of a stable and healthy economy, especially consistent economic growth, a stable employment, and increasing in productivity. But it does not always mean that economy is doing well. For instance, if people are not buying much or companies are not investing, it could be because demand is low, which means economy is slow. As you can see, the inflation rate for 2009 dropped to 0.6% due to decrease in demand because of global financial crisis. Also, during COVID-19 pandemic 2020, inflation rate dropped to negative 1.1%, and November 2023 is 1.5%, lower than November 2022, which is 4.0%, due to a continuous declining trend since August 2022. On the other hand, a high inflation can indicate strong demand and growing economy, but if inflation rises too quickly, it can also be dangerous. When inflation is too high, price increase faster than wages. This reduces our purchasing power and makes the cost of living more expensive. So, very high inflation is not good either. For instance, during the East Asian economic crisis of 1997 and 98, Malaysia experienced a sudden fall in the value of the ringgit, and inflation soared to 5.3% in 1998. So, increased production costs are one of the factors leading to inflation in this year. So this is the graph for high inflation, and this is the graph for low inflation. In conclusion, a high or low inflation rate is not the sole factor determining whether an economy is a good or bad state. We need to look at the overall economic situation. So, what we need is a healthy balance of inflation where it's not too high and not too low to ensure the economy growth steadily.
Type of inflation discussed in the study case is low inflation, as Malaysia's inflation rate for November stands at 1.5%, a sharp drop from 4.40% in the same period the previous year. This reflects a continuous decline in inflation rates since August 2022. However, when inflation is too low or if it enters negative territory, known as deflation, it can signal weak demand, reduced consumer spending, and a stagnation economy. Demand-driven low inflation often indicates a slowing economy. For example, the Malaysian Institute of Economic Research, or known as MIR, reported a decline in both the Consumer Sentiments Index and the Business Conditions Index. This suggests that both consumers and businesses are anticipating a bleak economic environment and have thus begin limiting their spending. If this reduced demand is driving the low inflation rate, then it is definitely not a cause for celebration. Furthermore, the article highlights the risk of deflation, where the inflation falls into negative territory and prices start to decrease. While this may sound advantageous, deflation can be extremely dangerous for an economy. It often leads to a cycle where consumers postpone purchases in the hope that prices will drop further. This causes businesses to cut production, leading to layoffs, reduced wages, and further economic contraction. A deflationary spiral, as seen in Japan's economy, can trap an economy in stagnation for extended periods. Another important consideration is that inflation rates can be misleading if not viewed in the right context. A low inflation rate does not always indicate that prices are falling. It simply means that prices are rising at a slower rate. Even though the inflation rate has declined, the average price level could still be increasing, which means that the cost of living for ordinary citizens continues to rise. Additionally, there is always the risk that prolonged low inflation could give way to deflation, which could bring even more severe economic challenges. Thus, while controlling inflation is vital for economic stability, excessively low inflation or worse, deflation poses significant risks that must be monitored carefully. Policymakers must aim for a balanced inflation rate that promotes both growth and stable prices without falling into the trap of weak demand and deflation.
Here is my graph.
The graph of historical inflation rates illustrates the fluctuations in Malaysia's inflation over the past few decades, which aligns with the economic context provided in the article. The peaks in inflation, notably in the late 1990s, can be linked to external shocks like the East Asian financial crisis, where inflation rose sharply due to the depreciation of the ringgit and increase in production costs. Conversely, the decline seen around 2009 reflects the global financial crisis, where inflation dropped due to a contraction in demand. A similar situation referenced in the article. Most notably, the sharp drop to negative inflation during the COVID-19 pandemic mirrors the trend in inflation discussed, where restrictions led to business closures and reduced demand. In 2023, as discussed, inflation dropped to 1.5%. This demand pull inflation scenario is further illustrated by the declining trend on the graph. Thus, while the inflation rate may be lower, it reflects an overall weak economic performance driven by demand shortages, questioning that it would lead to deflation if not managed carefully.
The policy measure of a contractionary fiscal policy which involves reducing government expenditure is indeed one way to control inflation. In Malaysia, this could mean postponing or scaling back large government-funded development projects as well as cutting back on government spending during inflationary periods. The idea here is that reducing government spending can help curb overall demand. When demand decreases, inflationary pressure tends to ease, helping to stabilize prices. However, it's important to understand that cutting government expenditure as a policy tool needs to be applied cautiously. While a lower demand can reduce inflationary pressures, it can also weaken the economy if not handled correctly. In the case of Malaysia, as mentioned in the article, the inflation rate has dropped to 1.5%, marking the lowest point in years. This could be a result of a weakened consumer and business confidence, leading to less spending in the economy. When people and businesses are unsure about the future, they tend to save more and spend less, which can slow down economic activity. So, while low inflation might seem like a good thing, it could actually signal an economic slowdown. Policymakers should carefully consider the trade-offs before implementing contractionary fiscal policies in the current context. One way to ensure this policy is effective without hurting growth is to focus on areas that might have lost impact on overall demand. For example, postponing non-urgent infrastructure projects while continuing to invest in critical sectors like healthcare, education and technology could help balance the need for inflation control with the need to maintain economic activity. At the same time, it's crucial to consider other complementary policy measures, such as monetary policy adjustment by central bank. The central bank could raise interest rates slightly to curb inflationary pressures by making borrowing more expensive, which in turn can reduce spending and investment. Instead of making broad cuts, the government should focus on targeting areas where spending can be reduced without significantly affecting the economy's growth. Additionally, other tools like interest rate adjustments and policies to improve consumer confidence should be considered to create more balanced and effective response to inflation. And now I'll be showing you my graph. The graph is a hypothetical downward trend in government expenditure from August 2022 to November 2023, showing a continuous decrease from 200 billion ringgit to 125 billion ringgit over the period. This graph reflects the idea that during rising inflation, the government can cut spending by lowering expenditure. It aims to decrease the demand for goods and services, which can help stabilizing prices and controlling inflation. However, in the article, while this approach can help reducing inflation, there is also the risk that cutting spending too much could reduce demand excessively. This could result in weaker economic growth or even stagnation. This is especially relevant in Malaysia, where inflation has already dropped to a low of 1.5% due to weak demand, as reflected by businesses and consumers cutting back on spending in response to economic uncertainty. In conclusion, the graph shows a gradual reduction in government spending, which can be an important tool for managing inflation, but it must be applied with caution to avoid weakening the economy further. Balancing fiscal policy is crucial to ensuring that inflation remains controlled while also fostering healthy economic growth.
At first glance, a lower inflation rate might seem like a good thing, like stable prices and predictable costs. But when inflation remains too low for too long, it can lead to some serious economic consequences. One major risk is deflation, which means when prices and wages begin to fall. Sounds great, right? Cheaper products, lower costs. But here's the problem. When consumers expect prices to keep dropping, they delay their purchases, waiting for a better deal. This leads to lower demand, hurting businesses and slowing down the economy.
When the crisis on the financial markets hits the real world. The Sakura City shopping mall in Hitachi, near Tokyo, abruptly closed for business 2 weeks ago. Around $20 million of its funding came from a subsidiary of the now collapsed U.S. investment bank, Lehman Brothers.
Japan is a prime example of how long-term deflation can trap an economy in stagnation.
Australia's welfare bill will surpass $120 billion this financial year as another budget blowout is revealed. It's the latest body blow to the nation's bottom line, but the Treasurer insists he has found a way to cover the costs.
In Malaysia, prolonged low inflation can also put pressure on government welfare programs. With less revenue, social subsidies like fuel assistance could be reduced. This would hit low-income Malaysians the hardest, widening the gap between the rich and poor. Even with low inflation, many Malaysians may still struggle with the cost of living, especially if wages don't keep up.
It all depends on how the money is distributed. Often when an economy grows very quickly, that distribution is very unequal. But is there a point when an economy has finally matured?
Low inflation can also slow down economic growth. If Malaysia gets stuck in a cycle of low demand, low investment and weak growth, it could face long-term challenges such as few jobs, slower progress and a drop in living standards. In summary, a low inflation rate might seem beneficial at first. The article highlights the risk of having inflation that is too low for too long. The potential consequences include deflation, straining government, welfare programs, and slow economic growth. Policymakers must find the right balance to ensure steady economic growth and avoid the dangers of deflation and stagnation. Here is the graph. The graph is showing the relationship between the inflation rate, unemployment rate, and consumer spending growth in Malaysia from 2019 to 2024. The inflation rate, which is the red line, shows that in 2020, inflation was negative due to the pandemic but spiked in 2021 as the economy reopened. It gradually lowered in 2023 to 1.5%. Next, unemployment rate, which is the blue line, shows that rose during the pandemic but steadily decreased as the economy recovered. Lastly, consumer spending growth, which is green line, shows that affected by inflation, it dropped in 2020 and recovered with economic reopening, but moderate blue line shows that rose during the pandemic but steadily decreased as the economy recovered. Lastly, consumer spending growth, which is green line, shows that affected by inflation, it dropped in 2020 and recovered with economic reopening, but moderated as inflation reduced.